In the spring of 2021, while working as a journalist in Moscow, I started receiving death threats. A shady pro-government website and similar social media groups with a mission to destroy all the enemies of Russia included me on the list of traitors to the homeland. People were accusing me of gay propaganda and saying I need a good man to rape me to get my thinking straight. They wished me in prison, exiled, or dead. My crimes, or as they were calling it, my political activities, were that I hold liberal views, I attend protests in Moscow, and I cover homophobic and transphobic laws in my articles. I also worked for a media organization labeled as foreign agent. According to Russian law, individuals or entities are designated as foreign agents if they receive funding from abroad or work for Western organizations. Practically, the law targets those who engage in civic activism or those who express opinions or whose words go against the government ideology. I'm queer and I'm a journalist. I knew that I'm not safe in Putin's Russia. So I agreed to an emergency relocation, and I never went back. This is how my journey of political exile began. I left Russia before Putin launched a full-scale genocidal war against Ukraine. Since then, most Russian journalists working for independent and Western media had to flee the country and are now dispersed throughout the world. Amidst this mass exodus, I often think, how do we tell the stories of exile? Probably one of the most important pieces of storytelling advice came from my editor back in 2019. I was writing a story about the Beslan school siege, a terrorist attack that happened in September 2004 in the town of Beslan in North Ossetia, Russia. A group of terrorists held over 1,000 people, mostly children, hostage for over 50 hours. More than 300 people died. I tried to interlace the stories of those dead and alive with what I saw in town 15 years after the terrorist attack. My editor sent me a note explaining how to put grief into words. Sometimes you start a story from afar, like this. 12-year-old Sabina had grown so much over the summer that her shoe size was 41. This is how her family recognized the body in the morgue, by the feet. Her mother genuinely believed the child would survive. Sabina saw terrorists in action films and was never afraid. Small details like this can take the person to the forefront, where before there was only an abstraction. These details reveal a life that we might recognize before the terror destroys it. The stories of exile, on the other hand, are hard to grasp. I first learned this by telling the stories of displacement and now living in exile. How can you even relate to those who are strangers to themselves? I experienced a different type of grief, marked by alienation from my life, a constant uprootedness. Today I'll try to narrate my story so that it makes sense, but bear with me, because in exile, the past is always unhinged. I left Russia on the 20th of July, 2021. I flew to Armenia and then took a minibus from Yerevan to Tbilisi. Georgia was witnessing the first influx of Russian immigration as Kremlin tightened control on independent organizations and media. Within a month, a Telegram group chat for Russian exiles had been joined by dozens of people. Familiar faces were flashing on the streets of Tbilisi, and I remember how terrified I was back then. One night, I woke up from my bed shaking heavily, and my first thought was that someone had broken into the house. I searched the apartment before realizing it was a mild earthquake Tbilisi is famous for. The force of nature felt less dangerous than the notion that someone might be after me. I felt disoriented and barely left my apartment. I kept applying for jobs and opportunities, constantly sending out emails and waiting. Exiles always wait. Trying to write my way out of loneliness, I kept a diary in English. I seized every opportunity to write in a dusty minibus that carried me away from Russia, every single morning in Tbilisi, on the planes traveling to and from Georgia, and in a dim hotel room in Chisinau, Moldova, before my US visa interview. Something inside me was rejecting the Russian language. Foreign parts of speech allowed me to filter out my lived experience to dry, fragmented passages. Otherwise, the exile's grief would eat me alive. Its language was Russian. The concept of immigration was present in my life from a very young age. Thinking back on it, perhaps I was always in exile. I was born in Moscow. I am of South Ossetian descent. My family moved to Russia from a small region in South Caucasus. As an ethnic minority, I was bullied at school, chased on the streets of Moscow, and beaten up. My mother taught me early on that it's not safe to speak the Ossetian language in public. As a child, I lived with my parents and younger brother in a small apartment southwest of Moscow. Every night, I used to hide in a bathroom. The floor, covered with slippery brown linoleum, served as my desk, where I wrote poetry. Only later I realized that I lived in what is called inner immigration, self-alienating from my country of birth, its society, and its views. Writing helped me to cope. When I was 16, I left Russia for the first time. I moved to England to study journalism, and that immigration was different from my current condition. I had some sense of stability and control rooted in my school routine, a permanent place to live, and a chance to travel outside the confines of my temporary home. I read Russian journalists Anna Politkovskaya and Natalia Estemirova for my classes, learned that journalists can hold the government accountable, and had the freedom that didn't exist in Russia. But at the age of 22, I moved back to what I thought of as my home, Moscow. I was young, bold, and angry, eager to do something meaningful with my life. What interested me the most was the Russian legal system and LGBTQ+ rights. Under the Russia's gay propaganda law, it is prohibited to share positive or even neutral depictions or discussions about non-heterosexual relations. But I've been closeted for most of my life, and writing articles was the only way for me to be a part of my community, until it wasn't. And so I fled. A couple of weeks ago, I met with a fellow exile to discuss writing about our condition. How do we narrate the complexity of exile so that others can understand it? My friend advised me to start with something shocking or funny so it's easier to grasp. They also suggested having a happy ending. No place is perfect, but you have all the rights and freedoms you've never had, they said, implying that my exile is over. But I don't agree with that. I arrived in the US in December 2021. During my first 8 months here, I moved 8 times, making it 14 in the course of a year. Writing a diary was the only constant in my journey. I also had to tell my story to people I've met over and over again. Hannah Arendt believed that human rights are contingent on membership in a political community, usually a nation. She called it the right to have rights. To claim our rights, we have to prove that we deserve to be in the society we got exiled to. Exile is marked by the constant effort to establish a voice and get a legal and social proof that we deserve to be in the place that will eventually become our new home. The absence of rights reduces the very existence of exiles to the stories we tell, whether to new friends, an audience, or an immigration officer. I want us to rethink ways of understanding exile. There is no guideline, no manual for those uprooted. We all tell our stories in our own capacity, or we don't tell them at all. There were days when my only coping mechanism, my writing, wouldn't serve me. There were days when I didn't know where the journey would take me, days where my grief would swallow me. And then there were better days when I felt like I owned my voice again. Exile is not finite. It doesn't end with a one-time border crossing, but lives on with bureaucracy, disorientation, and a lifetime of nostalgia. And in this space, all of us have to think how we speak and write about exile. Thank you.